Wayne Chastain is a Tennessee lawyer as well as a journalist. For the last few years, he has been investigating the murder of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. Mr. Chastain is one of only 2 journalists to ever interview James Earl Ray. At the Assassination Information Bureau conference held in Boston in January, Mr. Chastain's recently published articles were summarized, and Chastain followed with his telling of his interview with James Earl Ray and his version of the April 5th, 1968 assassination.
I'd just like to say one thing here. I'm not sure that Mr. Chastain would like to hear too much about this because he's the one who did all the work on this. He mentioned in passing his articles that appeared in, or I guess appeared over an 11-month period in Computers and People magazine. But in those articles, I think he paints a fairly convincing picture, just using circumstantial evidence and witness testimony and so forth, to indicate that there was a very suspicious individual at the scene of the Martin Luther King murder, and Mr. Chastain hints that he's learned a lot about this individual. And I'd like to, at least in capsule form, if you haven't seen those articles, just run it down to you. As Wayne said a little earlier, Martin Luther King was allegedly shot from the window of a rooming house at 6:01 on April 4th of 1968. About an hour and a half before the fatal shot was heard and occurred, downstairs in a very cheap cafe, I think it's Jim's Cafe?
Jim's Grill.
Jim's Grill downstairs. It's directly below the rooming house. An individual walked in there, a rather well-dressed man that looked out of place because it's a very cheap kind of restaurant where apparently a lot of winos and people like that dine. The man was well-dressed and manicured and so forth, and he came in and ordered sausage and eggs. And he seemed so out of place there that the waitress who served him and the man who owned the place got very sort of suspicious of him and remembered him. He ate there for, I guess he remained in the cafe for half an hour, ate his meal, appeared to be very nervous, and left. The shooting occurred about an hour after he left the dining room, and immediately the waitress and the man who ran the cafe were convinced that this man somehow was directly involved in the assassination. They said the way he behaved, he seemed to be so alert in a way, they were convinced he was probably the actual rifleman. When the shooting occurred, Martin Luther King's driver was on the ground looking up at King, talking to Dr. King. He said when the shot occurred, he turned around and looked at some bushes roughly behind the cafe and below the rooming house, and he saw a man holding a gun with a sheet over him. And he was sort of startled, and he began to take cover because he thought the man was going to take another shot. He said there was a lot of confusion. He turned around, and then the next thing he knew, he looked back in the bushes where he saw this man, not in the rooming house, but down in the bushes. He saw the man throw something away and then walk out of the bushes directly towards the murder scene. He walked almost directly towards the chauffeur. And at this point, a lot of other people were rushing to the scene of the murder, and the man sort of mingled in with the crowd as they walked up towards where Dr. King had been injured. Then the man sort of turned around and disappeared into the crowd just very nonchalantly. About 5 days later, after this occurred, 2 different parties in Memphis, Tennessee, received visits from an individual that was, again, very mysterious. One of the parties was an attorney in Memphis, a man named Russell Thompson. He received a call the night before saying that from this individual saying he was very troubled. He wanted to come in and get some very important legal advice. The next morning, before the secretary came in, Mr. Thompson was in his office, and this individual came in, very carefully left no fingerprints. He used, when he opened the doors to the office, he used a handkerchief in his hand. He made a great point of showing that he wasn't going to leave any trace. He then talked in detail to Thompson about the murder of Dr. King. He said he knew who the assassin was, sometimes implying that he might have even been him, sometimes saying it was a friend of his. But he gave a lot of inside information that jived completely with what Dr. King's chauffeur said. He said that the assassin had been hiding in the bushes behind the motel, that he had fired the shot, that he had disassembled the rifle, that he had stuffed the barrel in the back of his shirt, that he had walked towards the murder scene so he wouldn't attract attention. Then when a big crowd gathered, he turned around, walked about a block away, climbed on a motor scooter, and just drove out of town, and he was never suspected. There's sort of a fantastic story, and the attorney was, quite amazed by it. The man left, said he might get in touch with him again. That same afternoon, another individual called two Memphis ministers, and he basically told roughly the same story. He said he had a friend who was directly involved in the Martin Luther King assassination, that his friend had been put up to it. In this case, he said, by the mafia, more or less. He told the Memphis ministers one other rather interesting fact. He also said, and this was about a month and a half prior to the Robert Kennedy assassination, he said that the mafia also has a contract out on Robert Kennedy. He also made a fleeting reference to the fact that a mafia figure had been arrested in Dealey Plaza and had been turned loose by the police. Well, about 2 years later, this was indeed confirmed by researchers who indeed found that there was a mafia figure arrested in Dealey Plaza. It had not been common knowledge when this man told it to the ministers. In any case, this man vanished. Now, Wayne has been able to come up with some pictures of an individual that used to work for and perhaps even still to this day, worked for the Central Intelligence Agency, or at least appears to. He was very active in gun running. He was both pro and anti-Castro at various points in his career. Now, Wayne has taken these pictures and he's shown them to the man in the, first of all, he's shown them to the people in the cafe downstairs, and they identify him as the man who came in and ordered sausage and eggs. He then took these pictures and he showed it to Russell S. Thompson, the attorney, and he has identified him as the man who came about 5 days after the assassination with this strange story. Wayne then took the pictures and he showed them to the two ministers, and again they made the identification of this guy as being the man who came to them 5 days after the assassination with a lot of inside information on various assassinations. Wayne, anyway, I guess he refers to him in his stories as Jack Armstrong. But Armstrong is since sort of vanished from the scene. He's identified, I think, in Wayne's articles as an Arkansas resident or a Mississippi resident or something like that. And the most up-to-date information on the man is that he is now out of the country working for a fugitive financier somewhere. But he was, no hints, of course. But in any case, all of this is, one other thing Wayne did too, he showed these pictures, he did show these pictures to James Earl Ray. Wayne, I think, is only one of two journalists ever to visit Ray in prison, and Ray also recognized the man as being in Memphis the day of the assassination. Ray, apparently you can never be sure that he's telling you the entire truth, but he did say he saw the man downstairs near the rooming house, and he said the man scared him. He said Ray apparently said he saw the man, he appeared to be a government agent or something, he thought he was being followed, and Ray said as soon as he saw the guy and the way he looked at him, he took off, he just got out of there. So here are a lot of individuals that have recognized this same individual who has anti-Castro, perhaps CIA contacts, who was in Memphis, and who's been identified with, by a lot of people as having some sort of strange insight into the case.
If I can add, John, since you brought it up, the James Earl Ray, for some reason, wants to admit that he drove the car from Memphis to Atlanta. He may have. However, James Earl Ray doesn't smoke. The car, the white Mustang found in Atlanta, had an ashtray filled with cigarettes, two kinds. I don't know whether John did a very good job of recapping. It was very relevant material, and I should have alluded to it earlier. When the man visited the attorney, Russell X. Thompson, in the office, he was smoking Cuban cigarettes. In the ashtray of the white Mustang found in Atlanta were Cuban cigarettes. The two brands, Cuban and American. James Earl Ray doesn't smoke. Was suggested that if James Earl Ray drove the car to Atlanta, there were two other people in the automobile. And if he didn't drive the car, there were two men, and one of them, very likely, the man who, incidentally, the man's name that he gave the attorney was Tony Benavides, and that was strictly an alias, and he told the attorney that it was an alias.
Two questions. One, what's the speculation on where or who Ray worked for? And two, how did he get out of the country so quickly? And who's behind that? Or what's the speculation on that? Not fact.
That's a very pertinent question, and I can only answer it by speculation. The record is that Ray was an ingenious criminal. Now, this is the official explanation. A man who bungled every crime he committed until the time he pulled off the perfect one and escaped across 3 continents and went to Portugal and was out of hands, and all of a sudden he returns to England and is arrested. There's two versions on that. He got off an airplane. He wasn't even supposed to get off the plane. It was a layover. They were transferring passengers from BOAC at the London airport, that they wouldn't even have to go through customs, and they were taking them and putting them in another place of the airport, a waiting room. But yet Ray blunders and walks up and shows his passport to the information or the customs and saying that they misspelled his name or something, and that's how crafty. But I just don't think. Well, even had he been, if he had, what was the man's name? Eric Singh?
Eric Starbuck.
No, the other man that he used from Snipe. George Raymond Snee. A man that happened to, he picked out of, according to the official version, he picked it out of the birth directories in Canada. Yet everything suggests that somebody knew who this man was and that Ray could pass physically because he resembled a man. I just don't believe the official version. That's the only way I can answer your question.
Could you tell us which one of the, I take it you're referring to the Dealey Plaza pictures of the assassin, could you tell us which one of the men, Mr. Youngblood and Mr. Armstrong, resembled?
You were laboring under misapprehension. I've never brought up the Dealey Plaza pictures, and I'm highly skeptical. But none of the pictures, none of my research has ever identified any of those three men. In fact, possibly John has been successful in identifying one of them. But the man that we refer to as Jack Armstrong is definitely not one of the three tramps.
Let me follow up on this mysterious man who was explaining exactly how King was killed, the man that Mr. Chastain has identified tentatively. When he went to Russell Thompson, the attorney's office, 5 days after King was killed, no one was in custody for that crime. And here was a man explaining how the assassin shot from the bushes, his manner of getaway. Well, the only mistake he made, or the only lead that he gave Thompson that Thompson could follow up on was an address in Colorado where he and the roommate, the man who he said, my roommate killed King, where they supposedly had an apartment. So what Thompson did is he went and he investigated that address, and what he found was a man representing, or a man who had a good resemblance to Armstrong had actually lived at that address, and in fact his roommate was probably Eugene Brading, who is this mafia figure that had been on the scene at Dealey Plaza back in 1963, and that's.
Jeff, could I stop? I don't believe. If I told you this, I may have misled you, but Eugene Brading was not the second man. The way I wrote that was, I said there was a tenuous link established between the two men in the Denver rooming house and Mr. Brading, who had connections in Denver, and it was a very tenuous link. Yeah.
All right, well, let me just finish. All right, it wasn't a roommate, possibly a link to the two roommates. That Brading later, according to Peter Noyes, was at the Ambassador Hotel when Robert Kennedy was killed, 2 months to the day after King was killed. And then this brings in the statement that the Mafia has a contract out on Robert Kennedy that was given 5 days after King was killed.
Let me say one thing about that tramp picture that you were referring to earlier. I don't know if you people are familiar with it, but immediately following the Kennedy assassination in Dallas, the John Kennedy assassination, a number of people were arrested, and I think about an hour after the assassination, there were 3 men who looked like tramps that were taken off a train that was parked directly behind the grassy knoll in the railroad yard there. 3 men were found lying or hiding or something on the train, and they were taken into police custody. There are photographs of these tramps being led across the Dealey Plaza. They walk in front of the Texas Book Depository building, and then they go over to the Sheriff's Department. Since the assassination occurred, however, since their arrest, there was no record of them being taken into custody, and there's no record of them being booked or released or anything else. They apparently go inside the front door of the Sheriff's Department and they just disappear. In recent years, there's been a lot of people have looked at these pictures, and a lot of people have become quite convinced that these men were somehow members or part of the assassination team that killed JFK. Just to make a long story short, there is a minor link between these three men and the King assassination, and that is after King was assassinated, the FBI had drawn up a composite of the killer that was, or of the possible killer, who rented a room in the rooming house, allegedly the same room rented by James Earl Ray. The police had interviewed Mrs. Brewer, and she described the man. It was drawn up by the FBI, and then it was circulated around the country. Now, the face of the man on this drawing, I think that the resemblance between this man and one of the three tramps is startling. I think it's so close that it looks to me almost as if somebody had traced one of the three tramps in order to draw the picture that the FBI released. However, the other people who look at the same two comparisons don't see the similarities quite that sharply. I know Wayne next to me here does not. But that is the only link that I've ever seen photographically that connects the King case with the Kennedy case. Well, it's sort of the short man in the middle. Oh, it's hard to describe. Wayne says they have his identity. No, I did not know that. He's a short, sort of sharp-faced man. He's not the one with the hat. He's the short man not wearing a hat. Apparently Bill Turner, former FBI agent, believes he's identified him. No, I did not know that. So perhaps the man is. Well, there are tentative identifications on another one, but I'm not convinced it's accurate. Yes?
Excuse me, but Dick Gregory said that he could produce a photograph that would show Howard Hunt.
Yeah, that's the same photograph. That's the same photograph of the three men being led across Dealey Plaza. There were a total of about 8 or 10 photos taken. 4 or 5 have been surfacing in recent years. One of the three men, a short man wearing a hat, might resemble Hunt, but I've looked at it closely. My own opinion is it is not. A few other people say it is. I think most people say at best it's very inconclusive. In that same photograph, as a matter of fact, I think Dick Gregory says the tall man could be Sturgis. Again, there's a slight resemblance. Again, I think it's a little too simplistic a solution, and I don't think it is. But that's a matter of debate. But it's hardly conclusive.
If people want to look, I've got the pictures here.
Yeah, that's the newspaper there that really advocates that theory.
I just want on the record to say that the first man, which the short man whom they maintained that was a composite, or the model for the composite that was drawn from Mrs. Bessie Brewer. And Mrs. Bessie Brewer was a proprietress of the rooming house who rented a room to a man who called himself John Willard. John Willard, the night of the slaying, they brought in a very unusual FBI procedure. They brought in an artist who worked on a newspaper in Memphis for an editor who used to be employed by the FBI. They brought him in on the very sensitive interrogation of witnesses, which the FBI never does this. They had this artist draw a picture based upon Mrs. Brewer's description. Now, John and others say that drawing looks like the short man. I don't see the resemblance. Even Harold Weisberg, who's very skeptical of the relevance, the authenticity, and several other things about those pictures, he even alludes to the resemblance in his book. I can't see the resemblance. The other man, who's supposed to be H.L. Hunt, it's just a matter of years. In 1960, he's apparently an old man. E. Howard Hunt is not an old man today. I mean, he's balding, he's slim. The man in the picture that's very elderly, he's old, he sort of looks like he's kind of overweight. And plus, this was 11 years ago, 12 years ago. Hunt looked like a comparatively young man 10, 12 years ago.
Could you clarify just where James Earl Ray was at the actual time of the shooting? And does Ray feel that he was a patsy all along, or that somewhere he was double-crossed after the assassination?
I'll tell you what, I asked those same questions to Ray when I interviewed him in prison. Ray said that he came to Memphis. They were supposed to meet a gun runner, and that they were going to make a big deal, make a lot of money, and some revolution down in South America, something to make. And he was just, doing what he was told to do. He bought the rifle. He admits that in Birmingham, Alabama. He admits driving, and he admits the man who told him to buy the rifle was Raoul. Raoul said, take your time, drive toward Memphis, but don't try to get there too early or too late. Be there around the 3rd or the 4th. That's what Ray told me. The FBI has Ray going on March the 28th, driving from Birmingham to Atlanta, then to Memphis. Now, Ray says that he did not go back to Atlanta. He followed Raoul's instructions. He started driving toward Memphis. We documented where he stayed, motels. He arrived in Mississippi, right on the south of the Tennessee line there. Stayed the night of the 2nd. Would that be right? Yeah. On the night of the 2nd at the DeSoto Motel. Some records mysteriously disappeared of his restoration cards. Harold Weisberg has, and I believe, haven't you done some research on this? But the records that were taken from the DeSoto Motel does not have Ray's signature. Now, why he had lied to me about that, I don't know, but it wasn't Ray's signature. And these records were taken, and they're supposed to be in the custody of the U.S. Justice Department. And I believe, may be wrong, but Mr. Weisberg got certain information pertaining to this subject matter through the Freedom of Information Act. Anyway, Ray drove on to Memphis on the night of April the 3rd. He stayed at the Rebel Motel. My investigation showed that he had a visitor on the Rebel Motel, April the 3rd. At any rate, April the 4th, he checks out of the Rebel Motel, he drives downtown, he checks into the rooming house, and for some reason, for a long time, Ray never discouraged the fact that he was John Willard, that he went in and rented a room. Yet Mrs. Brewer said he wasn't John Willard. The description she gave to the police right after the slaying said he was a young man, about 28, 29. But I finally pinned Ray down in prison, and he conceded that he was not John Willard. He was not the man who rented the room. Why he held out that long, I don't know. And he never discouraged the fact that, in fact, he one time told William Bradford Huey he was John Willard. But at any rate, the story he told me, he was supposed to meet Raoul. Raoul had someone else rent the room. He went to the room, checked in, ran some errands, bought binoculars, admit buying binoculars, going back to the room. Raoul finally said, "You did good." Oh, you met Raoul twice. You met him in a bar down the street. And he walked in, and he walked in, and there was this mysterious young man. He never says, I questioned him very closely about it, and I never could get a straight answer. And the letters he gave Huey, he said, I walked in the certain bar, tavern, he called it. I walked in the tavern, and there was a man there who looked very funny. And there was Raoul, meaning there was two different men. He talked to Raoul, and Raoul told me to go buy the binoculars. Ray told me that he ran into the same man later in another bar. He saw him twice on that afternoon. He thought he was a government agent. He saw him, and I said, was he with Raoul? And he said, no, but it's strange that I saw him somewhere else once, and I think that was down in Mexico, and Raoul was nearby. And there was a doubt in Ray's mind that he was being followed, or Raoul was having him followed, but he never saw Raoul and the other man together. Okay? The man gave him $200 in the room, said, go downtown, go to a movie. We're going to meet the gun runner. We kept talking about the gun runner. The gun runner doesn't know who you are. He won't talk as freely if you're in the room. So leave. This is about 5:20, 5:15, 5:20. He gives Ray $200. White Mustang is parked at the foot of the stairway on the curb. And Raoul told him, don't take the car. We may need it. We may have to make a trip tonight. So just leave the car there on the street. And he said, we're going to meet the man about 6. We want you to be gone. So Ray descended the stairway. He said he saw the Mustang on the curb. He looked at his watch. It was 5:20. He knew he had an appointment at 6 o'clock, that they wouldn't be using the Mustang before that time, and he noticed there was a low tire. He said, well, I'll do him a favor. I'll fill the tire. He got in the white Mustang, drove it to a service station 2 or 3 blocks away. It was a crowded night, a lot of traffic. And he couldn't get anybody to fill the tire. Finally, a black man did come and fill his tire. That black man has disappeared, although another reporter, not me, wrote a story that was published in Enemy. His name was Willie Green. And he corroborates Ray's presence at the service station. Ray remembered, he said it was around 6 o'clock, he doesn't remember, but he remembered a fire truck ambulance. The fire department in Memphis operates the ambulances. A red fire truck ambulance drove by the service station. And if the service station that Ray said he was at, he'd be 2 blocks from the fire station. So that would be, and this was the ambulance that was going to pick up Dr. King after he'd been shot. And he said he had no knowledge. He got in the car, they filled his tire. He drove around. He was intending to find a parking spot as near as he could to the cafe. And he said the police had cordoned off the street, and there was a policeman in the middle of the block saying, you can't come in here, we're carting off the block. And he saw ambulances, he saw crowds, and he said, well, can I make a U-turn? And it was illegal to make a U-turn on Main Street in Memphis. And the policeman told him, I don't care what you do, just get out of here. And, he was panicked. You can understand a policeman out there, you want to block traffic. So Ray turned around, and he said, he didn't know what happened. What flashed through his mind was this man he saw twice in the afternoon near Raoul. Perhaps he trapped Raoul. Maybe there's a big arrest up there in the room. I don't know. He got in his Mustang. He claimed he headed back toward Atlanta. And he claimed he didn't take the expressway, I-55, which runs, at that time it didn't go all the way to Jackson, Mississippi, but he went to Grenada, Mississippi. And he said he took the back roads of Grenada, Mississippi, and he's almost in Grenada. This must have been about 7:10, 7:15 a.m. And he turned on the radio, and they start talking about 420 and a half South Main. Dr. King has been killed, and he said that's the first time he'd ever heard it. And he said he knew about his bundle being in the back of the car, and he thought it was still back there. And it wasn't until he got to Atlanta that he happened to open the trunk. Now, this is his story. I don't buy, like they say, liars sometimes tell the truth, and truth sayers don't always tell the truth. But anytime I can corroborate by extrinsic or independent evidence something that Ray tells me here, I think is true. And I think parts of that story is true. The driving to Atlanta alone, parts of it I can't buy. There are a lot of skeptics about this making a U-turn on Main Street, but I found several policemen that will confirm that there was a white Mustang that made a U-turn on Main Street. There's independent evidence through Willie Green, who I never interviewed, but a reporter on the newspaper that I worked on interviewed and had a story. I think Harold Weisberg might have made contact with Willie Green. But at any rate, Willie Green admits there was a man there with a low tire, and that, they had how they found Willie Green was that they sent reporters out on one of these "What Were You Doing When Dr. Martin Luther King Was Killed" series, and one guy said he was filling up a Mustang, a tire on a white Mustang.
So does Ray feel that he was a patsy all along?
Well, from what I told you, doesn't that suggest that he feels that way? I mean, he's a very enigmatic man. I mean, the interview, you can't always get the straight answer you would like to get from him.
Was there any, what sort of local support was needed for this assassination, if any? And Did you establish any connections with the evil town of Memphis at all?
You mean sort of like the Dallas radio broadcast and that sort of thing? Well, here we reach this line, you know, between investigatory and accusatory, and I'd like to just stay in the investigatory area right there. There are a lot of things that would suggest that he had local support.
George McMillan interviewed Ray also. Can you evaluate his work and what he's
has his book ever come out? I've been waiting it for 6 years. I don't know what he says or what he has. If I know Macmillan's thesis that Ray was a product of a Midwest Tobacco Road type, and that he strictly did it, and he doesn't really analyze the evidence, and he wants to write some type of human interest story on the family background, the environment that molded the man, and that sort of thing. If that sounds critical, it is.
Yes. Can you tell me why Ray would have taken this fall? Is it just as the information that you've heard about Mr. Ray is just a rather stupid man? Did somebody tell him, just keep your mouth shut, we'll take care of it, and after it's all over, you'll be rich?
William Bradford Huey, as I said earlier, testified before the grand jury in February, a month before Ray copped out. Before that grand jury, he says, he first says, he never tells the grand jury his reasons why, but he was convinced that Ray did it. He then proceeds to say, but I think Ray's protecting somebody else that's in on it. And Ray, and that, I'm not telling you this is not my thesis, it's William Bradford Huey, and I don't know what basis he has for it, but he's convinced that James Earl Ray's brother, Jerry Ray, is a man that he appoints as Raoul. At one time, I know the FBI followed that theory, except that they proved that Raoul was somewhere else and he couldn't have been there. But based on that thesis, Ray trying to protect somebody, it could be that he feels that his brother or somebody else is involved. Or a more satisfactory explanation, as far as I'm concerned, he just doesn't know the people involved. He's an ex-con on the lam. They were giving him money. They were telling him to go here, and you don't, bite the hand that feeds you. He's doing very well, and he just took orders. And I think when they sized him up for a potential patsy, they said, this is a good man. He does what he says, and I think maybe that's why he, plus the fact, look at it this way. He's got to stay in prison all of his life, if not the rest of his life. He's got to go back to Missouri. If he beats the Martin Luther King assassination, he's going to go back to Missouri for at least 20 more years. They may add an additional charge and convict him for prison escape. He has already admitted to holding one robbery in Canada. They may throw that at him. So the rest of his life he's going to be in prison. Okay? And I've had 2 or 3 experiences with hardened criminals that they will cop out and they will make the best deal they can, because the best they can ever expect out of life is prison life. What can you derive from prison life? Status. Huey develops a status theory, and I don't disagree with all the ramifications and aspects of the status theory, except that the status theory is a two-edged sword. You can argue it. So far, Huey's thesis is that Ray did it so he could go back to prison and have status and be respected as a first-rate criminal rather than a third-rate criminal. Okay? If that's true, why did Ray ever tell about Raoul in the first place? Because telling that story makes him appear the dumbest, the most stupid criminal ever he's used and discarded, and he never did get the big $1 million payoff. So why did he tell the story? The only thing I can figure out is that Ray sometimes has an urge to tell the truth like the rest of it, and sometimes he lies to bolster his ego, and there's times that he'll take credit even to his own lawyers of being the man who killed Dr. Martin Luther King. As I say, I doubt seriously he knows who's really involved. I think he may have a hunch as who some of the other triggermen were, but he doesn't have any idea who's behind. I mean, the real conspirators, the principals who planned, executed, and paid. He may have known some of the Confederates, but one reason he told me that the FBI wanted to make a deal with him and that they would spring him from prison and put him in another country. I'm not saying I believe that, but I asked him, I said, well, Jimmy, why didn't you accept the deal? And he said, well, you know something, once you start telling those guys anything, you can't ever satisfy them. You tell them what you know, and that's not enough, and pretty soon they're putting words in your mouth, and you've got to reconstruct your entire story. So I just rather not start singing at all, because if I start singing, they're not going to be pleased with the tune. And they're going to try to change the melody and add words here and there, and I just rather not cooperate with the guys.
Yeah, along those same lines, at the evidentiary hearing, I was following it carefully on the news up here, and they said that Ray thought or had been promised that if he pleaded guilty, he would be pardoned in 2 years. Apparently, he had been sold the line that Wallace was going to be the next president, and that as soon as it was politically feasible, he would be pardoned. And that, I think, was on the NBC.
That's Huey's thesis. Huey developed that thesis about George. He knew that Ray's brother was active in the George Wallace campaign. And from what evidence, Huey draws all these inferences, because Ray never said it. And Ray, I think, they may have thought Ray was that stupid, that they could make promises like that, and that Ray would buy it. But actually, it was Percy Foreman, according to Ray, who first made the promise about a pardon. And the pardon would not be from George Wallace. The pardon would come from a man who was expected to be elected governor 2 years later. This man, who he wasn't, he was defeated. And the man was a son of Percy Foreman's law associate, John J. Hooker of Nashville, Tennessee. And that Foreman was trying, according to Ray's story, Foreman wanted to get out of the case. And he said, we can do one of two things. I can plead you guilty, and then within 30 days you write a letter to the judge or do something that smacks or suggests a motion for a new trial, and you got a new trial, but I'll be out of it. He says, I want out of it because I have a lot of black clients in Houston, and if I defend you, I may lose that business. This is what Ray's telling me. Or there's a second alternative. There's another attorney by the name of Ben Hooks, who was the first appointed black judge in Memphis. Very fine gentleman. Foreman, he said, okay, now, if you won't plead guilty, we can go to trial, but I've got to have Ben Hooks as associate counsel so it'll win the confidence of the black community. Ray admits it, rejecting Hooks. From that, and he admitted it to me, Huey drew an inference from that Ray was a racist. He didn't want Ben Hooks. Well, it wasn't the fact that he didn't want Ben Hooks, but his brothers were paying for the defense. His brothers were racist. His brothers were supporting George Wallace. And Ray was going along with, what his brothers were telling him to do. And from this, I suppose, Huey, it was very easy for him to draw the inference that the brothers, they're getting his lawyers, they're paying for him. They must be in with Jump 99 premises. Rao is Jerry Ray. I mean, who knows how William Bradford Huey reasons. But at any rate, he turned that offer down. The third one was, okay, even if you're convicted, the son of my law associate, John J. Hooker, Jr., will be elected governor in 2 years, and I'll give you a pardon. There was pressure there for Ray to plead guilty. Foreman wanted out. Ray sort of consented. Foreman flew down to Houston. This is in February. A deputy sheriff heard Ray say something to the effect in the jail that he wasn't going along with a guilty plea. Percy Foreman flew up on a Sunday and had a quick conference with Ray, flew back to Houston, this in late February, prior to the hearing. I mean, that's how nervous Percy Foreman was that James Earl Ray wasn't going to plead guilty. And right up to the last minute, they weren't sure that James Earl Ray was going to plead guilty.
You've been listening to Wayne Chastain, a Tennessee lawyer and a journalist who has been investigating the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. Mr. Chastain spoke before the Assassination Information Bureau Conference held January 31st and February 1st and 2nd of this year.
Robert Cutler is an architect from Massachusetts. Using his draftsman's skill, he has studied the John Kennedy shooting and has authored 2 books on the subject. Robert Cutler has also researched the Chappaquiddick incident of Ted Kennedy, calling it a dirty trick designed to remove Kennedy from contention for the presidency. At a 3-day conference on the politics of conspiracy, Robert Cutler presented his findings and his theories. The conference was held in Boston under the auspices of the Cambridge-based Assassination Information Bureau. Robert Cutler.
I can't possibly talk over a microphone, and I trust everybody can hear me in the back of the room. You'll notice that the name on the board is Chappaquiddick Dirty Trick. It does not have a question mark. It is a positive statement. And therefore, because of the importance of what this implicates, I have written out my feelings about how this has developed and how it should be developed further. Therefore, if you'll pardon me, I don't like to read things, but I'm going to have to do it, simply because of its import. That the designers of this conference saw fit to include the incident at Dyke Bridge as a link in the politics of conspiracy should be a surprise only to a minority in this room who do not know that the death of Mary Jo Kopechne is one of the unsolved murders on the books of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. The objective of this workshop is to change this minority's mind by indicating the trail of events which point to Chappaquiddick as an almost perfect crime, a prime example of what the politics of conspiracy demands of those at the top. The starting point of this trail is an excerpt from Intercom in November 1974 issue of Genesis. Magazine, that is, not Genesis in the Bible. Quote, "A look at the power and the history of the 15 years lying behind Watergate suggests that there was indeed a conspiracy, possibly one whose reach extended beyond Crete and even the White House itself. With this as a point of departure, one can examine with a new perspective some of the events of the past 2 decades, which point to such a conspiratorial cabal in control of the executive branch. Reduced to its simplest terms, such a cabal existed solely for the purpose of dictating White House policy through control of its incumbent. To continue the domination, it was then only required to treat anyone who appeared to threaten the political life of this figurehead as an enemy. Over the years in question, the normal treatment accorded the enemy, with one notable exception, was death," unquote. In Rather and Gates, The Palace Guard, Harper and Row, 1975, I guess it is, Patrick Monahan, domestic chief of the guard, is portrayed not only as the link to Camelot Kennedy past, but also as the embodiment of Kennedy present. Everywhere Captain and guard turned during those first months of 1969, Teddy, the surviving brother, came on like the tide, threatening as sure as death and taxes to engulf the Oval Room and its paranoidal occupants in 1972, November. Quote, "Hence there could be no rest for captain and crew members alike until the Kennedy menace had been met and defeated," unquote. The authors attributed Kennedy's behavior after the accident to be the touchstone for the seemingly heaven-sent euphoria which descended on the White House that weekend. Always accepting the Midlothian Mirror, this continually parroted judgment by the press only shows its complete ignorance of the facts surrounding the murder of Mary Jo Kopechne. While the nation celebrated the telecasting of man's first step onto what many had considered to be nothing but green cheese, the landing most appreciated in the inner sancta of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue was the 088 splashdown in Poocha Pond. After that, everything was downhill to the 1972 November mandate, the acme of the politics of conspiracy. The trail now doubles back towards a cairn marking the beginning. The answer to the question why the Kennedy problem was so overwhelming in the minds of the top echelon of the executive branch. It started with the cover-up at 12:30 Central Standard Time on the 22nd of November, 1963 in Dealey Plaza. Thoughtful consideration of an excerpt from Cyril Weck's article, co-authored with R.P. Smith, published in the September 73 issue of the Forensic Science Gazette, is helping in understanding the pressures to which the conspirators were subjected. Quote, unfortunately, some of the autopsy materials, including some of the most important from the forensic standpoint, are not at the National Archives. We know, for example, that the President's brain was preserved and that several sections were prepared for microscopic examination. Moreover, certain sections were taken through the skin at the supposed wounds of entry in the scalp and the upper back of the President. The preserved brain and these various brain and skin tissue sections were examined by the autopsy team about 2 weeks after the original autopsy. And additional photographs were then made. All of these are described in the supplemental autopsy report published in the Warren Report. Yet these items, the brain, the microscopic sections, and the supplemental photographs, are all missing from the National Archives. We also know from the testimony of the original autopsy team that color photographs were taken of the interior of the President's chest cavity. All these items had been turned over to the National Archives by Admiral George Berkeley on the 26th of April, 65, according to a memorandum of that date. However, they are not included in the inventory of items officially transferred to the United States government by the Kennedy family on October 29, 1966, unquote. The importance of this information is that both Robert Kennedy and the conspirators knew what the now missing brain and chest cavity photographs show. This explains not only the action taken in the ambassador's pantry June 5, 1968, and the subsequent quashing of Thomas Noguchi's perfect autopsy report, but also the massive red herring of the 1972 campaign. This legacy now fell squarely upon the shoulders of Edward Kennedy, the lone surviving brother. If us versus them was the White House battle plan, the first of them may have been Senator Edward Kennedy, then a favorite for the 1972 Democratic nomination. Lucas came so close because of the press's superficiality in its handling of this case and its proclivity for pursuing personality and avoidance of toiling in the vineyard of hard facts. Chappaquiddick is still shrouded in the mantle of the senior senator from Massachusetts, the first victim of the ugly 1972 campaign. The accompanying fact sheets, those yellow sheets that are available to everybody outside, lists 4 major events which can help the weary traveler in the attempt to span the chasm ahead. 1. Low tide at the bridge at 11:30 Friday night means only 6 feet of water in the dredged channel. Furthermore, it means that a long arm's length from the car on the beach side of the channel, one could stand in about 4.5 feet of slack water, which occurs at every change of tide. Low tide at Town Dock, ferry crossing at 9:30 Friday night, and high tide at 10 minutes before the following morning means that a swimmer crossing between Chappaquiddick and the vineyard would be set not towards the Edgartown light, as was testified, but towards Town Dock by the flowing incoming tide. 3. 4 men handled the deceased girl's body between 5 minutes of 9 and noon Saturday morning. Not one of those men saw any blood on the victim's blouse. There were no bloodstains on the canvas stretcher on which she had lain the better part of an hour when it was secured. Yet 6 weeks later, the state chemist and his department head right up here at 1010 Commonwealth Avenue, discovered residual traces of the blood over a large segment of the back of the blouse. This means that before the car, with the girl out in the back seat, dove into the pond, something had occurred on the island of Chappaquiddick to cause the victim to bleed profusely at the base of the back of the neck. 8 hours in the salt water's tidal currents obliterated these stains to mortal eyes, and it remained for the benzodine test to expose the fact that foul play had been a factor in the murder at the bridge. Deputy Sheriff Huck Look saw the 088 on dry land, 7/10 of a mile from the bridge, 1 hour and 25 minutes after it had allegedly sunk. The fact that Judge Boyle attempted to discredit Look's testimony only attests to the court's handling of a non-conforming truth. This means that the gap between Look's and Kennedy's testimony must be resolved in any responsible search for the facts in this case. The press has indicated its research to be based on the same criteria used in evaluating the Warren report. Put your trust in men in high places, for they will never tell you aught but the truth. While this appears to place the senator from Massachusetts in anything but a flattering light, judge not that she also may be judged. It is the responsibility of everyone at this conference to determine the difference between the motive which foisted the falsehoods of the Warren Commission upon the American public and that which prompted Edward Kennedy not only to prolong his own existence, but also to save the lives of those he loves. Anyone who allows personal, subjective prejudice to interfere in this determination deserves to be left behind, barred from participating in the final assault on the yawning chasm athwart the trail ahead. The success of the Fabian policies of avoidance, retreat, and delay can be measured in the body count of the palace guard and its devious major domo along the road stretching beyond the mandate of 1972. 1975 is the year of exposure. It's never too late for another cudgel to join in the destruction of the politics of conspiracy. Thank you.
How do you explain rather bizarre behavior around the incident, like his lapse of memory and his swimming of the alleged swimming of channels? I mean, obviously, if what happened was not the case, I mean, why has Kennedy come forward and said?
I really think that you can answer that question. The question was, how do you explain Kennedy's bizarre behavior? One of the ways you can explain it is to read the reports of the press, which dwelt on this bizarre behavior ad nauseum and did not go into the facts. The only way that anybody can explain it is to think it out for yourself, imagine yourself in Senator Kennedy's position, and find out what you would do in that particular instance. I will say that the reason that I feel there is something that had to do with it is he was scared to death. And I use that term in its most gross application that you can possibly consider.
On the possibility that her death was premeditated, how do you explain the fact that he had to take a right to go over the bridge when, in fact, it was supposed to be on the way to the ferry, which was a left?
What I'm doing is I'm getting at the result at the end of my book by saying that he never took the right to go to the bridge. The car was ambushed and he was taken back over to the motel on the Vineyard, and she was taken somewhere else to wait until the time came when those guys drove the car by where Huck Look saw it, intercepted it, as you might say, and then they went down to the bridge and perpetrated the accident to make it look like an accident. In other words, this is a faked accident.
What do you think the purpose was of having Mary Jones Kennedy murdered?
Yes, the purpose is very clear. Senator Kennedy was going to, in effect, he would have been the Democratic nominee, and I feel reasonably sure that he probably would have won the election. And if he had won the election just as his brother Robert had become president, he would have opened the archives. I mean, that is perhaps an oversimplification of the thing. So in order to get rid of Senator Kennedy, you had three very good things. You had booze, you had the beach, and you had a blonde. Now, the fact that he was involved in such an accident eliminated him completely. Whether or not she had to be murdered is a question that I do not have the answer to. I cannot find out why it wasn't equally as valid to take some pictures of the blonde with the booze on the beach and publish them and achieve the same result. I don't know the answer to your question. I really don't.
Was he involved in the murder of Detective?
He was not involved in anything to do. He knew nothing until 8 o'clock the next morning. Absolutely nothing.
Excuse me, sir. I think you said that there was an ambush. Would you
yes.
care to explain that and elaborate on it?
Well,
as to what
the only way that you can find out how Senator Kennedy got back and over to his hotel room and knew absolutely nothing that happened to him, you must hypothesize that he was taken back and over into his hotel room. And then the next morning, finally, his friends Markham and Doggin came across on the early ferry and talked to him and told him about what had happened. But until that time, he knew nothing. So there is no way that I can explain how that could have happened. Plus the fact he's hit right here on the back of the head, right on the right mastoid, and a severe lump on the top of his head, and very bad back pain, which means to me a good going over. There was a most interesting piece in I think it was Esquire, where who's the lawyer for the Kennedy family? Victor? Who? No. The Marshall, Burke Marshall. Burke Marshall was quoted as saying that Teddy had, for the first 2 or 3 days, he seemed to have a fixation in his mind. He could not bridge whatever the events were. He kept thinking, and he kept saying to himself that he thought Mary Jo got away. Now, to me, that one little tiny bit of a sentence was most indicative of precisely what the arrangement that I had been thinking of as being the logical way to handle it was that they were ambushed. She may have scooted, and they caught her again, and they knocked him out, took him home.
Robert Cutler. His remarks were recorded at a 3-day conference on the politics of assassinations and conspiracies held in Boston the weekend of February 1st, 1975. The conference was sponsored by the Assassination Information Bureau. For more information, you could write to the AIB at 63 Inman Street, Cambridge, Mass. 02139. This program was produced by Pacifica Radio affiliate WBUR in Boston.